I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. This is a podcast episode brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Our Vayikra series, Kedushas in the Details, explores the way the laws in the book try and elevate each of our most basic human functions: food intake, bodily functions, relationships, spaces of worship, and time. This year, I'll be taking a particularly honest and candid look at the way these laws do or do not yet function in our lives. I remind you that sponsoring a podcast is a wonderful way to mark any occasion. Write me at podcast@matan.org.il or check out the donation webpage on the Matan website, or you can contact the office directly. Parshat Emor is centrally occupied with what is often called Parshat HaMoadot, a description of the holiday cycle from Pesach to Sukkot. It opens and ends with other topics, though. The beginning of the Parsha discusses special prohibitions for high priests and lay priests. This means that they are not allowed to become impure for certain deaths, have extra rules about hair shaving, about whom they are allowed to marry, and demand that they not have physical deformities. While some of these stipulations are well known because they sometimes cause strife for priests today, stripped of any actual temple duties but still bound by these laws, the idea behind them is quite clear. Just as the people of Israel have been chosen to live by a higher standard of purity, as expressed by many of our mitzvot, the priests are charged with living with that at an even higher level of intensity. The Parsha ends with the somewhat enigmatic narrative of the blasphemer, someone who in the heat of the moment curses in the name of God. This narrative reflects the standard of speech expected of the people. It doesn't matter with whom we speak, but that our speech must be pure. This law is taught to the people after the Israelite is sentenced to death by stoning, and illustrates that while there are many commanded laws in the Torah, they are often and sometimes best learned out from real-life circumstances. To further discuss today's parasha, I've invited to the podcast Rabbanit Dr. Tamara Spitz, who is the Rosh Beit Midrash and Mashgicha Ruchanit of Midrasha Torah V'Avoda. She lectures on various topics in Gemara, including Daf Yomi, Halakha, and Tefillah. Dr. Spitz has held academic and administrative positions at various midrashot and served as the Jewish Studies Principal of Instituto Yavne, one of the main Jewish day school schools in Uruguay. She also runs a chiropractic practice specializing in women's health in Gush Etzion. Tamara, it is a pleasure to have you here.
It is so exciting to be here. Thank you so much.
You know, this parsha kind of comes out of left field, I feel, in many ways, because we have spent a lot of time speaking about all these different mitzvot. We spent a lot of time in this series speaking about a lot of mitzvot that aren't really necessarily part of our daily life anymore. About korbanot, we spent a lot of time speaking about different kinds of bodily impurities. And now we get to something that I would even say is pretty practical, right? All these holidays, we've just finished Pesach, and we are indeed in the middle of Sfirat Omer, which I also really appreciate that this episode will be airing while it's also relevant to everybody's life right now, which isn't always the case in all of the podcast episodes that are aired. And I'll just add also particularly that, you know, we're going to speak about time, I think, in a broader context and what that represents for us and what we could do with time. I think it's also important that we mention that this episode will be airing in a week when time is utterly pregnant, right? In the week of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut. And I mean, as our conversation develops, it'll be interesting to see how that might sort of be in dialogue with the fact that there are times in our life where the time itself creates a reality, and sometimes where we create a reality within that time. So I'm sort of just throwing that out in the table between us, and we'll see where it goes. So why don't you bring us into the concept of Omer, right? Before we even get to the counting of the Omer, but to the Omer itself. So why don't you start there?
Beautiful. Actually, I love where you're looking to take this. It's exactly where I wanted to take it. I think maybe as an introduction, you were mentioning that it comes out of left field, but I think that there's a very common idea of Sefer Vayikra having a certain structure, right? This idea, and you've spoken about it in different podcasts, the idea of kedusha, of sanctity, starting in a place in the Beit HaMikdash or the Mishkan in the desert, and then moving, as you said, to the person's body, where we talked about the purity and impurity of the body. And now, yes, it's practical, but I think that it's very natural to go to the sanctity of time, right? As seeing kedusha in our lives, but in the calendar as well. And I think that is a beautiful way to understand the structure of Sefer Vayikra. So let's just introduce the idea of Sfirat Omer. As you mentioned, right, in this week's Parsha, we have the mitzvah of counting the Omer. The Torah tells us that after we celebrate Pesach, right, the Torah tells us that we then have to count Mimachorat HaShabbat, which we could talk about later, but Chazal explain, even though it means after Shabbat, right, Chazal tell us that it's the day after Pesach, that we begin counting on the day that we bring the sacrifice of the Omer, of the barley, and we're going to count 7 full, complete weeks. And then when we finish those 7 weeks, we're going to count in those 7 weeks, we're counting 50 days, and we're going to bring a new sacrifice, a mincha chadasha, and that will be the shtei halechem, and that's really what we see in this week's parsha. Interestingly, in Sefer Dvarim, we have this idea of Chag HaShavuot. It's mentioned more specifically in Sefer Dvarim. After we count 7 weeks, 7 times 7, we're going to celebrate Chag Shavuot LeHashem, and that is the idea of Shavuot coming after those 50 days of counting.
Yeah, an idea that always strikes me is the idea of also in the counting itself, which we'll get to, but we go from the harvest to also making bread, meaning the korban itself is all about the process, right? It's all about seeing the development of something and then creating something with that, which of course is also just a celebration of the agricultural achievement of, wow, look, the ground produces something and we're part of that. But obviously it'll get appropriated spiritually in a different regard later. I also just want to bring in, maybe one piece that connects to another, as you were describing that really beautifully before about how we're talking about Kedusha travels, right? It's in the mikdash, it's in the body, it's in time. I was also thinking back to just a different example. I'm sorry that my head always goes there, but the concept of nida actually is both.
Exactly.
And the nida, we've brought it up in the past as being both in so many regards. It's on the list of arayot, but it's also part of the tumot guf. And it has like this duality to it in many ways. And it also has that duality to it, that it's a kedusha, I would call it, more than a tuma. If we can sort of mix up our terms, you could check out last week's episode to see how I'm doing that. But it's sort of this, it also has a counting of time, which we'll get to how it relates to this, but it also has an element on the body. So it's just funny how that's constant. And I just want to say, this is like a ridiculous statement to throw out in one sentence, but somehow it always ends up being that women's bodies relate to more than one realm, meaning as much as we'd like to think that it's only ours, it actually has just many more properties that relate to much more than our own existence.
Exactly. And I think, first of all, I love that you brought that up. I was going to bring that up as well, right? It's the other time that we see that we need to count, right? Where you're commanded to count Sheva Nikiim, right? Where we're counting days. It's interesting that you're talking about the woman's body. I think that, as women also, right, this idea of this cycle of life, right? We're talking about agriculture. We're talking about, right, at a certain point in the year, it's fallow and all of a sudden things are growing and you see this productivity where there was literally nothing a month ago and all of a sudden things are growing and sprouting. And I think that our bodies as well, especially, right, where we go through this monthly cycle of again, productivity of fertility. And I think that that's something
of harvest. It's literally harvest.
Mamash. And I think that we're very connected to this idea of counting. And I think that it's something that's very intrinsically a part of us. And on one hand, it's very physical, very biological, but on the other hand, there's so much kedusha to be brought into it. And I think that that's really what the Torah is teaching us, right? There's an agricultural cycle, and you can look at it and say, right, kochi va'otem yadi, wow, I worked so hard, look at this harvest. Or you can say, wow, this is so miraculous that yesterday there was nothing and all of a sudden there are things growing. So I think that duality, that reflection between what's going on in our bodies is also what's going on in nature around us.
Right, that's so beautiful. I feel like I never thought about the korban of shtei halechem as being the child that's born, but there's an element to that. It's that physical creation based on based on the miracle of natural growth in the world.
I think it's also interesting to understand, I think, and we mentioned this a little bit, right? This is the Parsha of all the Chagim, and we see that all the Chagim have a specific date, except for Shavuot, right? Mm-hmm. And we're seeing here the intrinsic link between Chag HaPesach and Shavuot, which isn't even mentioned here in our Parsha. There is no idea of a Chag Shavuot. We do have this idea of counting. And after we count to 50, we're getting to this new stage, a new level. I think agriculturally, it's fascinating to understand that the Korban HaOmer is barley. That's the first thing that is being harvested, which is actually animal feed. Mm-hmm. As opposed to wheat that is growing slowly, and only in 50 days will that wheat be ready to be harvested. Mm-hmm. And Chazal really speak about this transitional period between the barley, which is animal food, to the wheat, which is human food, right? We're going from the Korban HaOmer to the Shtei HaLechem, to this Korban that's going to be given on Shavuot, which is about elevating to a new level. And I think it's interesting to think about that transition from Yitziat Mitzrayim, from the slaves that were taken out of Egypt, to what we're getting to, which is Matan Torah. Interestingly, that doesn't appear in the Torah, the reason for our count, but Chazal tell us and inform us, no, right? We have to realize that we're counting to a new level, right? The slaves that came out of Egypt are not ready to receive the Torah. They need to go through this process. There needs to be time that takes us from this physical redemption that is going to lead to our spiritual redemption. And that is going to happen in 50 days from now. And I think it's interesting to think about, what do we do in that time? We need to count days, weeks, but what else do we have to do? And that's something I want to think about as well.
So two thoughts came up for me as you were describing that. The first is, if we can just keep going on with these, female/romantic metaphors, it's not my idea. I believe I read it in a shiur by Rav Meidan, and I think it's Chazal that he was bringing, but the idea that this is the engagement process, right? Meaning that, exactly. Again, famous idea, but yes. that these 50 days are the process moving up towards the wedding date, which is Shavuot. Again, none of this appears in the Torah. All of this is part of the elements of Parshanut. The debate regarding when do we actually start this count, versus the day after Pesach versus the day after the first day of Pesach, or is it on a Sunday as opposed to Shabbat? This whole process is like historically mired in the need for oral Torah, meaning exactly. This as opposed to all the other chagim, which we get a lot from the psukim. There's something specifically about this. So therefore, I think also meaning we never need an excuse to bring in Chazal, but Chazal is like, they're intrinsic to the way this mitzvah developed. They're always intrinsic, yeah. But even more so than I would say Sukkot and Pesach in terms of how we're able to bridge a reality between the psukim and actually halakhic facts on the ground. So that was the idea sort of about the engagement process. And the other one is, of course, that famous question of why count up versus count down, right? Which is a question that, always comes up. And we'll talk about the weeks versus the days, but versus the counting up and down, there's always something somewhat subjective in these answers. But I do want to say that, we've been speaking until now about process and about creating and about a creative process. And when you count down, it kind of lessens the need for that time, meaning it lets you know that time is simply a portal to getting towards a goal. Because I'll delete it, meaning, I passed those 3 weeks already. I don't need them anymore. Versus when you count up, and again, I might be making this up. This might be totally subjective to the way I function. But when you count up, I think there's more of a internal or even like a philosophical statement that this time itself is part of the process. Meaning if you count it down, done.
Right.
I'm over, right? But there's something of when you count up that every day you remember how much time has passed that lets you know that this isn't just a means to an end, but like this is, right? Whether you want to use the metaphor of, it's the journey, not the destination, but like this is why we're here. We're here for not just here for the bread at the end. We're not just here for the harvest. We're here for right now.
Exactly. Like it's funny that you say that, because when you think about counting down to the end of school or counting down to something very exciting, you put an X on the day.
Exactly.
You're like, done. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, fine. Another day done. I'm just getting towards that end. And I think what's really beautiful about counting up, like you said, is that we're acknowledging that this day is important. We're saying, this is a whole day that I have to experience what I want to experience. And that's going to lead me to the next day, to tomorrow. I'm building up. It's almost like a building, right? Mm-hmm. I can't knock down the foundation to get to the penthouse. Beautiful. It's great that you want to be at the penthouse, but you have to go through, right? You have to climb those steps to get to the top. I actually found a beautiful piece by Rav Soloveitchik speaking about exactly what you were just talking about, or we were just talking about, in terms of time and Sfirat Omer. Can I read it?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Because he speaks about the fact that when we're counting, we're connecting, or we're being mindful of the past and the future. And that really is what Sfirat Omer is about, right? We're not Xing out days just to get to something, right? You're talking about the journey and the destination. We're experiencing something now that is helping us become better in the future. So he says that Jews are aware experientially of the past and committed to the future, which is a reality to him. To exist as a Jew means to be at the juncture of past and future, of that which is no longer real and that which is not yet real. And our mission is to live in both those dimensions. And I'm skipping but to the next paragraph, and he basically talks about time awareness, which is a challenge. And he says, if he's indeed questioning that synthesis of memory and anticipation. And I think really that is what Sfirat Omer is all about, right? Memory of, we have to remember that we came from Egypt, that we were slaves, the incredible miracle that was Yetziat Mitzrayim, but with that anticipation to Matan Torah. And that, I think, is what Sfirat Omer is all about.
I'm thinking about that kind of like heart space. I'm thinking about right in my heart, not hard, what that creates for somebody, because, today, it's a catchphrase at this point, like live in the moment, mindfulness, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. This is much more than that, because mindfulness is being in the moment right now, right? Not being judgmental, not letting other thoughts flow in. But I think Rav Soloveitchik is speaking about something much broader and deeper, and I would say Jewish, which is that no, meaning you're in the moment now, but you're aware of what came before you, and you're also aware that you're heading somewhere.
Exactly.
And I find that very often a lot of like the New Age ideas, many of which I have benefited from greatly, I find that so often they come so short because when they're appropriated into Western thought, they just focus on the person themselves as opposed to focusing on that there's also higher powers, or that you're connected to things before you, or meaning they don't always do a great job for lots of reasons. A lot of times the root cultures where those come from also don't have those beliefs. But I think that for us, it just also brings up for me, Eheyeh asher eheyeh, that, when Hashem says to Moshe, is that like, we're speaking now, but I'm letting you know that as time goes on, I will continue to be with you. And now, to be totally tangential, I'm just throwing in an idea because I don't know if I ever said it on the podcast, but there's a great little video from Rabbi Sachs where he speaks about, you could Google it, he explains why he named his book that he wrote long ago, which unfortunately is highly relevant right now because it's all about anti-Semitism, called Future Tense. Yeah. And he said that he called the book Future Tense because of the phrase Eheyeh asher eheyeh. Wow. And because he said Judaism is, and again, for many obvious reasons, probably because our past was always so horrible, that we are the only people in the world who always believe that tomorrow could be better than today. Wow. So he like I think in different language, like hones in on this idea of like being aware of multiple tenses at the same point.
Right. It's actually interesting that you mentioned this idea of Judaism thinking about past and future versus maybe mindfulness, which might be like kind of focusing in on ourselves. I noticed, and I didn't really see if someone else mentions this, but I noticed that in our Parsha, it says, Usfartem lachem, in plural, but in Dvarim, it says, Shiv'a Shavuot tispor lecha, that there's this, I would say, a national communal aspect, and there's the individual aspect. So I don't know, I haven't seen, do you know if someone speaks about it?
Know,
but I think it is interesting I do want to mention the Ktav and Kabbalah speaks about usfartem lachem, that this counting needs to be for us.
Which is again the same language used by the Nida.
Exactly. Exactly. Meaning there is this idea of a personal count, but realize, and again, I teach tefillah, and it's something I'm very passionate about, that when we say lachem, or when we say, when we talk about tefillah in the plural, we don't mean to exclude the individual, right? It's the individual recognizing that we're always part of a community, of a nation. And I think the same thing here, right? The nation is going through this transitional period, but so is the individual. And I think that that's something to think about as well, right? That on one hand, I, the individual, need to get from day 1 to day 50, but we as the nation need to get from day 1 to day 50. And I think that that connects a little bit to what we were talking about in the beginning of these days of national significance, and how each individual is dealing with a lot, and the nation is dealing with a lot. I mean, so is the world. And it's interesting to think about like how we fit in, right? I think as Jews, we're always very mindful of ourselves as individuals, right? Im ein ani li mili, but im ani latzmi mani, right? That we're always feeling that tension of the individual and the community. And I think Sfirat Omer also recognizes that, right? The fact that I, the individual, right? The halakha tells us that every individual needs to count Sfirat Omer, but we're communally counting together.
I just want to respond to one piece about the individual versus the collective. So in some work on Tehillim that I've done, one of the major questions that comes up in Tehillim is that often there's a massive blurring between individual psalms versus collective psalms. And very often what you have is also a mixture of individual and collective. And so in the middle of the Mizmor, it'll all of a sudden switch to speaking in the plural. And scholars in what they've done, mostly in form criticism, and in the very unexciting. I really appreciate scholarship, and it's obviously the bread and butter of my Tanakh study. I find it the most unhelpful when it comes to the study of Tehillim. But what they do is, of course, say, "Oh, well, it was 2 different Mizmorim that are put together," because they have a hard time with it. But it's too present in so many Mizmorim for one to say that. It just doesn't hold water, that claim. And what usually I think one should say in all of these Mizmorim is that exactly that piece, meaning we live in a world, because our world is so individualistic, we see this sharp distinction between the individual and the collective. Whereas in biblical times, and certainly later on, that wasn't the case, meaning this concept of like self-definition actually comes up, interestingly, in the Amorinic period, and we've actually mentioned that I think 2 episodes ago, but it doesn't exist at this moment in time. So like this blurring, which to them was obvious, to us is a lesson of like, let's not get too focused on how big we are in this broader collective. I just wanted to put that piece on because it comes up in so many places in not just in Tefillot today, but the Tefillot of then, which was Sefer Tehillim. It's the exact same dynamic.
Amazing. I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. Fascinating. I think I'm going to move on to the the concept of the actual counting and the way it's set up. Right, the counting is set up as we are told to count Sheva Shabbatot Tmimot, 7 full weeks, but we're also told that we need to count in the next pasuk 50 yom, 50 days. And Chazal mentioned, and we've been discussing throughout how the psukim are, I don't want to use the word bare, but don't give us a lot of reason for the things that we are told to do. And Chazal actually say for halakha that because of these two psukim, we actually have to count the days and the weeks. So much so, what does the word tmimot mean, right? That they have to be complete weeks. The Gemara explains in Masechet Menachot that the fact that they have to be full weeks or complete weeks, halachically we actually have to start the count at night. And that will make it 7 complete weeks. As we know in Judaism, the day starts at night. And therefore, if you wait till the morning, you've almost like lost an opportunity. And the opportunity is to really be fully engaged in this time period. And therefore, you're going to count as soon as possible, right? The soonest possible moment, which is nightfall or at night. And that's when we count with a bracha. And we know halachically, if you miss that nighttime opportunity during the day, you can still count, but without a bracha, because now for that day, it's not a complete day. And that really brings us back, as we mentioned previously, to the idea of Sheva Niki'im, to the counting of those 7 clean days that the Zava in the Torah needed to count, right? The woman needs to count 7 clean days. They need to be full, complete days, so much so that if she does spot in the middle or she does see something, she has to recount, right? You have to start that count again. We don't have that idea in Sfirat Omer, which is interesting, right? That going back to our individual versus community or national idea, it's 50 days. Whether you lose count or not, Shavuot is coming on day 50, which I think is a fascinating idea. I was actually speaking with this with my niece, and she was saying that it's interesting that we want to find meaning, and I want to talk about that a little bit more later in each day as we count. But that's beautiful. And you could say, wow, on day 18, I've worked really hard. I'm ready for the Torah. It's not how it works, right? It doesn't matter if you're ready for the Torah on day 18. Matan Torah is only coming on day 50. And I think that that's an interesting idea of Sfirat Omer. And I wanted to call it, in the beginning, we were talking about the Kedusha of time, right? That we see sanctity in time. I think that something that's unique about Sfirat Omer is that we're seeing sanctity of the person within time, meaning you need to wait a certain amount of time. It's objective. It's not subjective. You could be ready whenever you want, but the Torah, you're getting it on day 50. And I think that that's an interesting idea to think about, that we have to go through this process. So to write the Sheva Niki'im, there needs to be 7 clean days. Only after that can the woman go to the mikvah. That there's a certain amount of time. The same thing with Tzara'at. There was this amount of time you had to count, and only then could you begin the next stage or the next process. And I think that that's really what Sfirat Omer is teaching us, that we need, right, usfartem lachem, it needs to be a personal counting where we're trying to improve ourselves, but we need to wait those 50 days, and only then can we receive the Torah.
Oh, wow. I have so many thoughts in response, but I think I'm just going to share 2.
Okay.
One is directly on what you just said, because I think that the comparison here, the better comparison is to the Nida and not to the Zava, because the Zava has to count 7 clean days. And if something goes wrong, she has to restart. Now, that's what we do today in our halakha, but the Nida has the exact same thing as Shavuot. It's 7 days no matter what.
Yafeh.
Meaning,
Beautiful.
no matter what happens in those 7 days, she goes to the mikveh of them. Halavai shezeh yachzol, right?
Exactly.
But meaning, at the end of those 7 days, she goes to the mikveh. And so it's actually very similar. It's saying the time is the factor and not, obviously, if she still has her period at the end, she can't go to the mikveh. But I'm saying with the assumption that she's in the normative category of the menstruant woman and not in the abnormal category of the zavah, so she just goes when she goes. So I never thought about that, about like there's the process and then there's the end point, which doesn't move. Like you have to get there, which also, by the way, from a spiritual inner work standpoint, I think is healthy, meaning having a goal that doesn't move. And you have, okay, and you know what? Let's be honest. Maybe some people need 30 days and they can get there. Maybe some people need Bemet 48 days. Do you know what I'm saying? Meaning different people. So we have like a assumed set of time, and then we work within that framework. So that's just one piece. I think the comparison is phenomenal. It's just that it needs to be to the nida and not to the zava.
Okay.
And the other piece is just the word tamima, which I didn't think about it until now, which obviously I should have. But meaning it's the word that we describe also the korbanot.
Exactly.
So meaning it's something there. The Torah sort of appropriates this word for time. It's like another way that Sefer Vayikra tells you that everything we've been talking about in this book really circles around the same point. Meaning these are all ways that one is mitkarev lakadosh baruch hu, a way that so sometimes it's in the form of a korban, of an actual animal offering, and sometimes it's in something like this. It's of accounting, but with that word tamim, kind of like reminds us that these are they're all, I'm going to use a word I used earlier in our conversation, but like they're all in the same orbit, they're all in the same space.
Exactly. And I just noticed it when I was preparing to discuss this with you, the idea that I think it's intentional. It's meant to bring us back to that idea of the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash, meaning exactly as you said, right? This time period is a time for personal improvement and thinking about our own acceptance of the Torah. But we can't forget that this is connecting us to Kedusha and the Kedusha of the Beit HaMikdash, which is exactly why when we finish counting Sfirat Omer, we add in the Harachaman. Right? A lot of people ask, why is there a harachaman hu yachzir lanu et avodat Beit HaMikdash? Why are we talking about the Beit HaMikdash if I'm talking about leaving Egypt and counting to Matan Torah and Pesach and Shavuot? What does it have to do with the Beit HaMikdash? And I think that, right, Sheva Shabbatot Tmimot is meant to bring us back. We're not complete without the Beit HaMikdash, right? We have to remember that Kedusha is a part of our lives. And yes, we're finding Kedusha in time, but we're missing the Kedusha in space. And that's something that we have to yearn for. As we were talking, I was thinking of something else. A lot of the commentaries talk about this time period as a time period of tahara, of purifying ourselves, and a time of kedusha, of sanctity. And I was thinking, we have this duality of the weeks and the days, right? 7 weeks and 50 days. And I think when we think a little bit deeper, right, 50 days remind us of the 50 levels of tum'ah, right? We have 50 levels of tum'ah versus, right, we the Chazal tell us that, right, Bnei Israel were so impure, they were at level 49, and Hashem had to get them out because otherwise it would have been too late. So this idea of 49 levels of impurity, of tum'ah, but if you flip it, it's 49/50 levels of purity, of tahara. So I think that it's interesting to think about the world of Tumah and Tahara in the 50 days versus the 7 weeks, which I think is all about Kedusha, right? When we think about Shemitah, right, we're sanctifying the 7th year, right? That Shemitah year, we're giving our land a time to rest. We're sanctifying the land, right? So maybe this idea of 50 days is about purifying ourselves, whereas 7 weeks is about sanctifying ourselves. And maybe it's an idea that we could think about, which is, right, we talk about sur mira va'aseh tov, right? I want to take away the tum'ah in my life. I want to get rid of my bad habits, and I want to be better. And maybe that's what Sfirat HaOmer one aspect could be, right? I want to get out of that, those impure things, the negative things in my life, and I want to look forward to those positive, sanctified things in our lives.
The only thing I would add to that is if we, in the beginning, started our conversation by speaking about the fact that, like all the Chagim, at least according to Chazal, Shavuot has both of these elements of also the historical event and also the agricultural. So I would take that idea and also sort of copy it to there, that we have the, I would say, spiritual Avodat Hashem side, which are these levels of Tum'ah that are going to be repaired by the tahara that one achieves throughout this. And you have, from the land perspective, the obvious comparison is to Yovel, meaning it's the 50 of Yovel, which
Beautiful. Will
be the topic of next week's episodes. We don't have to go too deep into
Great.
that,
but exactly.
But that's the agricultural side of things, meaning we have an element of, the element of this 50, not just the harvest, meaning the actual 50, the process of 50 is something that is reminiscent of the process of Yovel, which we'll, again, hopefully try and talk about the essence of what that is next week. So I think that it, again, is sort of the 50 itself plays on both sides, both the, historical / the spiritual side of things and the agricultural side.
So I think just to summarize what we really discussed today, when we look at the psukim in the Torah in this week's Parsha, we really see that Sfirat Omer is connected to the agricultural world around us, to the barley crop that is now growing, that animal food, that base, lowest level of harvest that we have at this time period. And we're counting the 7 weeks and the 50 days till we get to day 50, which is Shavuot, as we know, where we're going to bring the korban shtei halechem, which is going to be made out of wheat. And in essence, we're hoping that this time period is going to be a time period of growth, a time period of transformation from the slaves that left Egypt during Pesach to the nation of Israel that is going to be receiving the Torah on Shavuot. And we spoke about this idea of the national counting and the individual counting, and the idea that every day we are not only counting today and being in the moment, but we are acknowledging and remembering the past, and we're anticipating the future. And that's really what Sfirat Omer, I think, is about. The idea that time can be sanctified, but we can be sanctified through time. And I think that really it's an opportunity for every day to be meaningful for us, to think about how we can become better people, whether you're using this idea in terms of Kabbalah or the Sfirot, or working on different midot, working on different character traits that you want to work on. I think that Sfirat Omer is really an opportunity for us to become better. But as we said, in 50 days, Shavuot is coming, whether we're ready or not. And I think that that's also a very powerful statement, that we're all going to get there. What we do at the time is really up to us. But I think that it really is a time that, as we use that idea of building a building, right? We're building those floors to get to the top. And really, I feel it's an opportunity to improve ourselves as individuals, but also recognize that we're part of a nation, and to really feel what the nation is feeling, and maybe bringing it back to the days that we're really feeling right now. I think as individuals, part of a nation, I think that we're dealing with a lot of emotions, and I think that it is important to be in that time, in that space, but also recognize that day 50 we're getting the Torah no matter what.
So just as a final sort of thought in response to that, which is that in an earlier episode that I did with your good friend, with Shuli Mishkin, where we spoke about sort of how Chazal were very successful, in a way too successful, where they sort of took the world of the Mikdash and translated took Judaism with a mikdash and translated into a world without one, that we see that process is also visible here, meaning where the Omer, in a very basic sense, right? Matan Torah doesn't exist in the Torah. There's no clear connection between Matan Torah and this period of time, but it's really focused on the harvest, and it's focused on the harvest that brings to the korban. So in lieu of that, right, or in a world without that element, Chazal and many later, as you said, Kabbalah, which is already much, much later, has sort of put this into a new frame of that internal spiritual work. And that's what became of many things. That something that was sort of an externalized national experience became a more internalized personal one. I think of what we did in this conversation is sort of emphasize the importance of not losing sight of like the broader national piece, which I think is also really important. And the last thing is just that metaphor of sort of receiving Torah on the building that you're creating during this time, which is that it's true that anybody could get there how they want, but either the Torah sits on strong foundations or it'll sit on weak foundations.
Beautiful.
And so it's true that someone could catch that Torah. That's the image in my brain. Like someone could catch that Torah and it could sit there. But after a little while, there'll be fissures in that foundation, right? There'll be, if it's bad building materials, they're going to start falling off. And the more that we create stronger foundations, the stronger and more lasting that Torah can sit on those foundations. So that's a call to myself, by the way, to utilize this time for that. That's like a good reminder for myself, and if anybody else, that's also relevant for them as well. Really want to thank you for being here today.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.